So the steps that I have on the front sheet, you guys have done before. You guys have done those steps before. I didn't do anything to these steps. These steps are the same that you did on the quiz last week, right? For binomials and trinomials. Then why is it a new lesson? Well, some of these steps are going to look a little different. It's the same steps, but they're going to look a little different than they have in the past. Okay? That's the catch. Do we still do the steps? Do we still do these same steps for binomials and trinomials? Yeah. But there might be a situation where we need to do something different that we haven't done. Okay? So most of what you do is you've done before. That's the way math works. You build on things. So most of the time, the stuff we do, you've done before. Okay? Not all of it, but some of it. A lot of it. Okay? Okay, so here we go. Example number 1. Let's jump to number 1. So it says solve. So how many answers are we going to get for this guy here? 4. So we got to figure out 4. Okay, so the first question is it a binomial or is it a trinomial? Has it got 4 terms? It's a binomial, right? So binomial, we have steps. They're on the same page. They're on the board. They're in your notes other places. Let's use those steps. So step 1 for a binomial says, is it in standard form? Yes. It is. Step 2 says GCF. Is there a GCF? And if there is, figure it out. So there is a GCF, right? So first thing is 4 and 36. What's the GCF for 4 and 36? 4. And then how many x's can I take out? Squared, right? You guys got this, right? This part you guys have done many, many, many times. Okay, so 4x squared on the outside. So that's going to leave x squared plus 9, right? You guys have done that before. So now we're going to focus on the inside of the parentheses. So after we do for a binomial, we make sure it's in standard form. We make sure that we factor out a GCF. The next step is difference of squares. Is this difference of squares? Yeah, no. Yeah, it's close, right? It's very, very close. But it doesn't have the minus, yeah. Don't force it. Leave it. If it's not difference of squares, leave it, okay? So then the last step that you did on the quiz last week was set everything equal to 0. Set all the factored terms equal to 0. So we're going to go 4x squared equals 0. X squared plus 9 equals 0. This is where it might be a little different. Okay, this is where it might be a little different than what you've been doing. Okay. So first of all, let's start with this guy over here. How do I get rid of the 4? Do I add it, subtract it, multiply, or divide it? Divide, because it's multiplication, right? So let's divide by 4. X squared equals 0. Squared, what's the opposite of squared? Square root, right? And then when we take a square root, how many answers do we get? We always get 2. Well, what's the square root of 0? What times itself makes 0? 0. So we get 2 zeros. Good. That part you guys have done before. So there's 2 of our answers. We need to get the other 2. Well, the other guy's going to give us our other 2, right? Okay. Okay, so first thing I got to do is get x by itself. So what am I going to do first? Subtract 9, right? We said this wasn't difference of squares, so we didn't change it. And it's not. So we get x squared equals negative 9. What's the opposite of squared? We just talked about that. Square root. We're going to get 2 answers, right? We always get 2 answers because when we take square roots, we always get 2 answers. Here's a question. What's the square root of negative 9? So the square root of positive 9 is 3. So it's going to be a plus and minus. Not 3, because negative 3 times negative 3 makes positive 9. Positive. Yeah, positive and a negative. But the numbers we multiply together have to be the same. So we can't multiply a positive 3 and a negative 3. There you go, right? This is what we did last week, remember? If there's a negative in the square root, there's always going to be an I. That's one of the new things we're going to talk about today. We're going to get things that are imaginary. The square root of negative 9 doesn't exist. The square root of positive 9 does exist. So how do we show that it doesn't exist? We have an I. So if you have a negative in the square root, guaranteed you're going to have an I. That's the way I usually do it. When I'm trying to solve these, I'm like, oh, okay, so I know it's going to have an I, so I write I down. And then I'm like, okay, so what's the square root of 3, or 9? 3. 3I. Right? So if it has a negative in the square root, guaranteed it's going to have an I. Okay? If there is no negative, then do it the way you've been doing it. Right? Okay? All right, so let's look at number 2 now. So those are 4 answers. 1, 2, positive 3i, negative 3i. Okay, let's look at number 2. Flip it over. Let's go to number 2 now. Number 2, still a binomial. So we're going to do the same thing we did last time on the last problem. It's already in standard form. It's got a negative in front, so I know at least there has to be a negative something there, right? So what is, it's going to be negative 2, right? No x, right? There's going to be no x's down here because 2 doesn't have an x up here. So it's just going to be negative 2. Okay. Negative 2 divided by negative 2 makes 1x to the 4th. Negative 2 divided by positive 2 makes a negative 1. Okay. Then we look at the inside. Is this difference of squares? Yes, it is. But it's not a squared. It doesn't matter. It just has to be an even power. 4 is even. Okay, so what is this going to look like?
X squared plus and minus 1.
There you go, yep. Half the power. So x squared and x squared plus 1 minus 1. Are any of those guys difference of squares? Yeah, one of them still is, right? X squared minus 1, so we have to do it one more time. Now this one's not going to be x squared anymore, it's just going to be x. Yeah, because you half the power, right? Everything else comes down. So x squared plus 1 is going to stay because it's not difference of squares. Set everything equal to 0. Negative 2 equals 0. X squared plus 1 equals 0. X plus 1 equals 0. X minus 1 equals 0. Okay. You guys have done this before. This part, so far, nothing you guys haven't done before. Okay, so let's start with the first guy. What am I going to do? Is this guy going to give me any answers, I should say? No, because it doesn't have an x, right? It doesn't have a variable. So if it doesn't have a variable and negative 2 doesn't equal 0, this guy is not going to give me an answer. Okay, go to the next one. What am I going to do here? Minus 1 from both sides. Good. Minus 1 from both sides. So we get x squared equals negative 1. Square root. That means 2 answers. What is the square root of negative 1? 1i. Yep, 1i or just I. You can put 1i or you can just put I. Either one's okay. Right? Because the square root of positive 1 is 1. We need an I there because it's negative. Yeah, what's up? Always an I. Yep. If there's a negative under the square root, there's always going to be an I involved. Yeah.
If it's a positive, then it would be negative I? Or...
Nope, there'll be no I. So if that was positive 1, you wouldn't need the I.
Okay. So if there's a negative, just add the I.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, if there's a negative under the root, just put an I. Yeah, that's the way I usually do it too. Next one doesn't have a root. That we don't have to do square root because it's just x. So we get x equals -1. And then the last one, we add 1 to both sides, and I get +1. So I get 4 answers. +1i, -1i, right? -1 and +1. There's 4 answers right there. So 2 of them are imaginary. 2 answers are imaginary. 2 answers are real. Sometimes they'll ask that. They'll be like, how many real answers did you get? How many imaginary answers did you get? Well, I got 2 real and 2 imaginary. Okay? All right. That's binomials. The next one is trinomials. So notice it doesn't say solve anywhere. How do I know that I'm solving, though? Roots, yeah. They ask for what are the roots. It's the same thing. Solving, you're finding the roots. You're finding the zeros, right? So this means I am solving. This one's not a binomial, it's a trinomial. Okay, so we have to use those steps. Step 1 for a trinomial says it has to be in standard form. Check. Already in standard form. Step 2, GCF. Is there a GCF besides 1? No, yeah, this one, nope. Okay, ABC. So let's go to ABC. A is 1, B is 12, C is 61. So multiply to be 61, add to be 12. So we got to figure out the 2 numbers that multiply to be 61 and add to be 12. Off the top of my head, I don't know. So I'm going to go to my calculator. 61 divided by. I know 2 doesn't work. Let's try 3. No. 4. No. 5 won't work. How about 6? 7. 8. 9. 10 won't work. How about 11? Oops, 9. 10 won't work, we said. I was close. 11. 12. 13. Nothing's working. Well, if nothing's working, how do I do my x? And the answer is sometimes you can't do it. Sometimes you can't do it. What do? There's got to be another way, and there is. Something you've done in math too. Quadratic formula. The thing about the quadratic formula is that it looks ugly. It does, kind of, it does. Has got a lot of different things going on. But the nice thing about it, it always works. It always works for any trinomial. So anytime you're trying to solve a trinomial and the x doesn't work, that always works. That always works. Like when I was in school, there was no x. The teacher didn't show us this. This is a newer thing. This is the last 20 years teachers have created this as a shortcut. My teachers always used to say, this guy always works. This one always works. You could have used this on your last test. The reason I didn't show that to you was because the x worked. But sometimes the x is not going to work. So if it doesn't work, or last test, the last quiz, some of you were trying this and you're like, Mr. Flores, or you're asking Mr. Lara, I can't get the 2 numbers here. I can't get the 2 numbers. And there were 2 numbers, but you couldn't get it, right? Well, now you have another tool. Now you have another strategy, another technique. Use this guy. Go right to that guy. It'll work. It works every time. Okay? So how do we use it? You used it in math too. There's a song that goes with it. There you go. Yeah, you guys know that song, right? I don't do the song. It's not my thing. But if it helps you, use it.
Mr. If I say make us say
Yep, Mr. Feistel likes it, Mr. Yates likes it. I don't do it, Mr. Siegel doesn't do it either, but some teachers like it. If it helps you, if it sticks in your head, that's good. The thing is, though, you don't have to memorize this because it's going to be in your notes, and you can use your notes on the test, on the quiz. So, okay. All right, so how do we use it? Well, it starts out -1, parentheses, plus or minus square root, parentheses, 4 parentheses, parentheses, and then 2 parentheses. Now, in those parentheses are going to go A, B, and C. Okay, in those parentheses are going to be an A, a B, and a C. So, A goes next to the 4 and next to the 2 at the bottom. Always, always, always. It's always going to go next to the 4, and it's always going to go 2 at the bottom. B always goes in the first 2 parentheses, here and there. C goes in the one that's left over. Okay? So, let's simplify. So, start piece by piece. Don't worry about the whole thing. Like you see the whole thing and it looks intimidating. Don't look at the whole thing. Look at piece by piece. So let's start in the front. -1 times 12. -12. So -12 is going to go in the front. Now let's go inside the square root. What is 12 squared? What is 12 times 12? 144, right? Mathematics facts. 12 times 12. Okay, so then you got, see, you could think of this as a -4 or a minus sign, either one. Don't think of it as both. It's not a negative and a minus. It's one or the other. I usually leave it, I usually consider it a minus and then just multiply. So 4 times 1 times 61. I think that's 244, I believe, if I can remember from last class. Okay, and then on the bottom, it's going to be 2 times 1, which is 2. We still have some, now we got to subtract. Grouping symbols. So we subtract what's on the inside. 144 minus 244. -100, yep, -100. So we have a negative underneath the square root. What should that tell you it's going to happen at the end? It's going to be an I involved somewhere. We're going to have I's somewhere. All right, so now let's finish. -12 plus or minus. What is the square root of -100? 10i, yep, 10i. So it's going to be 10i here. There's the I. So now I have a -12 and a 10i on top, and I have a 2 divided. The 2 is actually dividing both of them. So I'm going to give each -12 and 10 divided by 2. Hey, what's up? So if you can divide those 2. If you can't, reduce them, and then you're done. So 2 goes into -12 -6 times, right? -6 plus or minus. And then 2 goes into 10, 5i, right? How many answers is that? 2, because one of them is plus, one of them is minus. But the thing is, I can't add them to make -1 or subtract them to make -11 because one of them's real and one of them's imaginary. They're different. So you're done. I said I was going to get 2 answers at the beginning, and I got 2 answers at the end. That's as far as I can go because I have an imaginary. Okay? So when do you need to use the quadratic formula? When the x doesn't work. You can use it whenever you want. You can use it on every trinomial you need to solve. Some people like it. I've had some people say, Mr. Floyd, I like it. I like doing this. I don't like doing the x and that. That's not really my thing. I like using this instead. Go for it. Go for it. Okay? But most people like to use the x instead. Do that. Okay? All right. So we're going to do number 4 together, and then you're going to do number 5 on your own, and then we'll be done today. All right, so number 4. Find the roots. Find the roots for 9x squared plus 18x plus 13 equals 0. Trinomial? Standard form? Already? GCF other than 1?
No.
3 is close. 13 doesn't work for 3. 13 kind of ruins it. So yeah, I think just 1. GCF is just 1. Okay, so ABC. Okay. 9 times 13 is 117, and then 18 on the bottom. I have no idea what goes into 117. I could use my calculator, but let's say there are 2 things that go into 117. I don't want to spend 5, 10, 20 minutes trying to figure that out. So I'm just going to go right to the quadratic formula. There might be 2 numbers that multiply, okay? But I'm not worried about that right now. I'm just going to go right to the quadratic formula because I don't want to spend time on that. Okay? So -1 okay, so A goes next to the 4 and next to the 2. B goes in the first 2 parentheses. C goes in the only one that's left, the only spot that's left. So -1 times 18 is -18, plus or minus. 18 times 18 is 324. 4 times 9 times 13 is, I believe, 468. Yeah, thank you. And then 9 times 2 is 18. Okay, so we got -18 plus or minus. Underneath the square root, I have to subtract. So I get -144. Okay, so I get -18 plus or minus. What is the square root of -144? 12i, yeah. The square root of +144 is 12. Just needs an I. So here's the thing. I've seen students do this. I've seen students do this before on tests and quizzes. They do this. Why is that wrong? Because I already took the square root, right? I don't need the square root anymore. So if you already took the square root, you don't need it anymore. It's just regular 12i. They're each divided by 18. Divide if you can. Well, this guy I can divide to make -1, right? Negative 18 divided by 18 makes -1. The other guy I can't divide, but I can reduce. What's the biggest number that goes into 12 and 18?
6.
6. So you get 2 and 3. So you get 2I over 3. Done. Okay. So there were two numbers. In fact, there were no two numbers that would have multiplied. I didn't spend much time doing this, but there weren't. How do I know? Because I got a negative underneath. If that was a positive 144, I wouldn't have had an I. That means there would have been two numbers here. That's how you know. If it's a negative, there weren't two numbers here. You could sit there for a year and try to figure it out. There would be no two numbers. Okay? So those of you on the test, the test will take like in 2 weeks. The week before Thanksgiving, that's when we have the test. But we just took a quiz last week. So those of you that are stuck here with a trinomial, now you have another option. Okay? Now you have another option. All right, so number 5. I want you to do number 5 on your own. I'm going to walk around, see what you get. We'll go over it together, and then we'll be done for today. So when you do the x for this one, it's close. It's actually close because I can do a -10 and a +2, and that'll make -8 when I add, but it won't. It'll make -20, not +20. So that's really close. Yeah, I'm doing it right now. You can also do -4 and -5. That makes +20 when you multiply, but it doesn't make makes -9 when you add. So it's going to be really, 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 really close. So I don't think it'll work. So we have to use quadratic formula. Okay. A is 4. B is -8. C is 5. So we get -1 times -8 makes +8, plus or minus 64 minus 80 over 8. 8 plus or minus the square root of -16 over 8. The square root of -16, 4i. Divide by the bottom number, and you're done. So +8 divided by +8 is 1. I can divide these two by 4. So you're going to get 1i over 2. Okay.